When everyone was tired of the game, dates for the Saturday evening dance were arranged. I attended the dance and stupidly accosted a drunken soldier from a tank outfit. His shirt was out of his pants and open down the front. He had slopped beer on his clothes. I said, "Button up your shirt and act like a man." In a rage he hit me, and of course it was easy to deck him. Immediately 2 MPs appeared. Thank the Lord, a man who worked for one of the trading companies stepped forward, explaining he had witnessed the entire thing. I turned to the MPs asking, "If you are policing this dance, where were you when this man made an ass of himself?" They played dumb, but I knew they had been drinking. Back at Camp Samambula, I attended a meeting at battalion headquarters the following Monday night. The new regimental commander was there to question me about striking an enlisted man. I could read the writing on the wall. He was out to get me. He knew who I was. He said, "I'm going to send an officer over to Ovalau and thoroughly investigate you." I had no answer other than to say, "That tanker hit me and I hit him back." Thinking it over, I decided my remark to the 2 MPs was what had created the problem. They had reported the incident to cover themselves. The regimental commander picked Captain Tom Conlon to investigate me. Evidently, he didn't know Tom was a friend of mine. When Tom asked me what had happened, I said, "Look up the man at the trading company. He'll tell you what transpired." Tom had a fine 3-day vacation and vindicated me fully. When he went to Island Command to get his payment of expenses and per diem, he was told our regimental commander had no authority to authorize the trip. Such is life. Colonel Dunn initiated a new policy for company commanders. We were to meet each Saturday morning at 10 a.m. to inspect all 5 company kitchens. Just before noon, he held a critique of each kitchen before delving into other general problems. His last subject hit us like a bomb. Gonorrhea was exceptionally prevalent among the women around Suva. Each company had several men incapacitated with venereal disease. Colonel Dunn began to quote some startling figures. Captain Closter of Company F must have a very high moral influence on his men, far greater than any of you other commanders. He has only 7 men in the hospital with the disease. Stimson, you have 24. Walker, you have the same. The rest of you are not any better off either. We were puzzled, knowing Closter's men were as horny and attracted to women as the rest of the men in the battalion. However, we couldn't argue with the statistics. Figures are figures. Later, a day or 2 before we were to leave Fiji, the truth came out. Our surgeon came to me smiling. "I've solved the mystery of Closter's high moral fibre. I just got a requisition from Company F for 300 packets of sulfur wound tablets for their jungle aid kits. Those damned medics in Closter's company told the men to take all 12 of their wound tablets with a canteen full of water if they went whoring. It would prevent them from getting the clap. It's damn lucky some of them haven't died from crystals in their kidneys. That's one of the dangers of sulfur pills." We company commanders breathed a sigh of relief and hoped Colonel Dunn got the word. If he did, he never let on. When we left Guadalcanal, Colonel Ben Northridge had been transferred to a camp in the southwest United States. He was to impart his knowledge of jungle fighting to new soldiers. At this particular military camp, they had a soldier free-ride station near the gate. Ben picked up 2 soldiers from the East Coast, one of whom sat in the rear seat of his car. Down the road some distance, the man in the rear crushed Ben's skull with a large wrench. The 2 men were deserting. Stopping at a curve in the road, they hauled his body into the desert, leaving him for dead. A truck driver on a night schedule spotted something far out in a field as he made a curve in the road. He stopped his vehicle, knowing something was wrong. He found Ben barely alive and got him to a hospital. Ben survived, but the blows did massive damage to his brain. He was, to me, one of the finest officers I ever met, kind but firm. He had been a schoolteacher prior to the war. Early in December 1943, we were warned to prepare for a move to Bougainville in the Solomon Islands. Just a few days before Christmas, we were notified to load aboard ship the very next day. The word travelled like wildfire in Suva. Shortly after 7 p.m. that evening, my city friends showed up to say their farewells. George and Edward Kakabau were both with their units above Nosori, but George's wife, Addie Gus, Marge Saffings, plus many others came out. They brought flowers and bottles. The party began swinging at about 9 p.m, continuing until daylight the next morning. Our company officers and many of the battalion officers took turns dancing with the girls. Addie and Marge traded at the piano, while Gus accompanied them with his banjo. It was a grand send-off, enjoyed by all. Before the night was over, empty bottles littered the floor of the officers' club. After loading my friends back into their cars at dawn, I returned for transportation to the dock in Suva. Aboard ship, shortly before the supper hour, we were surprised to hear Tokyo Rose saying, "All of you boys in those ships about to leave Suva, Fiji, are doomed to die." I knew there were spies in the pay of the Japanese. In New Caledonia, the Vichy French owner of the local radio station was caught red-handed. His code was adapted to music he played, according to our information. Knowing the many wonderful and patriotic people of Fiji, I wondered who could stoop so low. It seemed money could corrupt, or was it pseudo-patriotism? We landed Christmas Day, 1943, on Bougainville and quickly moved ashore. The Marines had again been the advance force here, landing on November 1st. My S.3 responsibilities were few. The main work rested with company commanders to care for their men. As we marched inland, we passed elements of the 37th Division. To my surprise, I was hailed by a soldier from my hometown. A few hundred yards farther, I was again stopped. This man was a friend from Bathgate, North Dakota. Our first encampment was crude, upon a side hill, a mighty poor location. Finally, after a week of boredom, we were moved to a new bivouac area recently abandoned by a Marine unit. At the tail end of each company street was a small, clear river, about 30 feet wide and 4 feet in depth, a branch of the Piva River. The current was slow, excellent for bathing. I dearly wanted to get back to a company command, any company, preferably rifle. My chance came sooner than expected. I was to take over Company E. I had worked with them on Guadalcanal and knew many of the men. They were a National Guard unit from Williston, North Dakota. Many of the men in the company had been the Class A basketball champs of Dakota in 1940. It seemed every high school boy in the state, in whose town a National Guard unit existed, augmented his income by enlisting. I had done so in 1937. Before leaving the 2nd Battalion headquarters, I consulted with the mess sergeant, Anna Dale. He had his ear to the ground and told me the Company E kitchen food was poorly prepared. He advised, "Tell them to shape up or go back to the line." He also confided, "If you need replacements, I'll get good men for you." My first talk was with the top sergeant, the mess sergeant, and the cooks. Things improved immediately. Good food is the most important thing to soldiers. It must be the best possible. I knew the reputations of the present officers of Company E. They were all well qualified, with past combat experience. A new officer, Lieutenant Charles Ross, had been assigned to the company just before my arrival. He was sharp and eager to learn. Officers come and go. Suddenly, I received several seeking temporary quarters until assigned to other companies. Eventually, all were assigned elsewhere. Rotation home was slow, based on a point system, with a minimum of 80 points required. Even so, the selected few were supposedly drawn by lottery, and there were about 3,000 names in the pot. I lost a fine first sergeant, Sanday, to rotation, so I promoted Joel Fedji to the post. He was superb officer material. Later, when we ran out of officers, he refused a commission, citing his care for the entire company. Some officers at regiment managed to get a 45-day leave to the States, but to my knowledge, no line officers were selected. Perhaps we were judged expendable. I soon found there were favourites at headquarters, the bootlickers and the ones who played badminton with our regimental commander. One of my officers became so broken up over the sudden death of his mother that he moped and cried for days. The Red Cross helped me send him home. I didn't need faint hearts. He would have affected the morale of his platoon. In his place, I received Lieutenant Paul Clemens, a Texan, a remarkable man and fine soldier. Before we found a generator to power electric lights for the company, the 155mm rifles across the road snuffed out our nightly candles each time they fired. Happily, Pete Scherer, one of our officers, was selected to spend time with Special Services. He trained the division boxing team. He was also adept at scrounging, getting us a brand new easy washing machine and a 5-kilowatt generator from the Seabees. We traded Japanese weapons for them, also getting a water pump for the washer and the shower facilities. Setting the wringer washer by the stream at the end of the street, we rotated a crew to wash clothing daily. We also organized a lumber crew to cut trees for boards. The use of men for this task was prohibited, so it had to be done surreptitiously. On weekends, we bribed the sawmill operator at division with beer, running the machinery ourselves, thus getting framing lumber and boards for our tents, all of solid mahogany. At one time, we were the only company in the battalion with a 100-watt light bulb in each tent, a laundry, shower heads, and raised framed tents with board floors. The men also hung a lighted sign along the road. Easy City, population 187. A mystical number we never reached because of casualties. We got a new battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Samuel G. He organized a huge garden, company details cleared, planted, and cared for the future produce. Weeks later, we enjoyed fresh vegetables and sweet corn. Lieutenant Scherer and I also started a tomato patch in front of our tent that was successful. A huge training area was cleared, requiring an enormous amount of work. The 245th Field Artillery, our regimental support, often lent us their crawler tractors and trailers. We found the new area loaded with chiggers, which had to be removed at the conclusion of each day's training. Those who neglected to do so suffered itching and open sores. Later, at an old Japanese bivouac area west of the Torokina River, another regiment of our division found these chiggers or lice infected with the deadly scrub typhus. Some men died of it. At the north end of our battalion, next to Company E, which I came to call Easy Company, was a 90mm anti-aircraft unit. To our west, just across the road, stood 4 155mm rifles of an artillery unit. On our south was the 245th Field Artillery. We became accustomed to frequent artillery fire. The Japanese fired a 150mm gun quite often, but usually their shells were directed at the airstrips. From the distant flash on the horizon at night and the sound of the gun, we estimated the Japanese gun to be 5 miles to our west. We began routine patrols to scout out the Torokina River area. We found Japanese telephone lines crossing the river in the vicinity of hills 250 and 600, which we cut, removing all the wire we could. Their wire was easy to spot, a bright yellow. It became risky to cross the Torokina. We did, but with caution, using covering fire. The jungle was thick, with no trails except the so-called East-West Trail. It ran inland, paralleling the coast, established by natives many years earlier. This trail was firmly blocked by the enemy. It wasn't until a few days after the attack of the Japanese troops on March 8, 1944, that we travelled it with a vengeance. A new commanding officer was assigned to Company H, a young West Pointer just out of school. He had evidently gone directly from graduation to the infantry school at Fort Benning to earn his first lieutenant's bars. Lieutenant Dick Hamer, the Company H commander, with his previous Guadalcanal combat experience, was set back from company commander to executive officer since his promotion to captain had not come through. This was an obvious WPPA, West Point Protective Association scam. Sad to say, due to his lack of experience, this new officer was killed on his first patrol. About noon on February 28th, I was called to battalion headquarters and told to ready Easy Company to recover the body of Lieutenant Richard Combs, who had been left dead under enemy fire. Under strict orders, we were never to risk men's lives to recover a dead man. But this was different. This was a West Pointer. Easy Company left the Company B front perimeter line, along with a forward observer from the 245th Field Artillery, Max Kalansky. He was assisted by 2 men carrying his 612 radio. Our departure time was 1 p.m. I was informed that the 245th Field Artillery would fire intermittently at the top of Hill 250 to keep the Japanese heads down. At about 2 p.m. we approached the bottom of the hill. Suddenly 4 rounds of 105 mm shells came in on us, one exploding in a tree just 30 feet overhead. Max and I were just below that tree. The remaining 3 rounds cleared other trees, impacting about 50 yards to our front. Kalansky immediately put the 2 sections of his radio together to order a ceasefire. Meanwhile, I found 2 of my men seriously wounded. When Max asked who had changed the fire order from the top of the hill to the bottom, he got no answer. Combs lay on open ground, in full view of the enemy above. The distance to him was about 150 feet from our jungle cover. Dick Hamer, Combs's second-in-command, had accompanied us on this trip. It looked like kamikaze to go out in the open to pick up Combs, but it had to be done. Thinking it over, I said, "Dick, let's take off our sidearms and jackets. Maybe they'll let us pick him up." He agreed, so we shed our upper clothing and moved into the open. Why they let us retrieve Combs's body, I'll never know. They were either compassionate or sleeping on the job. Both Dick and I were pretty dicey about it, expecting to be shot at any moment. It only took a minute. We hurried. On my 300 radio, I was told to send Combs back with my wounded, but to stay out with Easy Company until the next day. I puzzled over this, as it was only 2 miles back to our line. There was no legitimate reason to keep us out in the jungle. Why did they want us to stay overnight? The next afternoon, we entered the Company B line, and a forward observer from the 245th came to me. He was nearly crying. He said, "I didn't do it. Please believe me. Your regimental commander stood beside me and ordered me to fire at the bottom of the hill. I told him your patrol was nearly in that position, and it would be too dangerous. Your bird colonel said, 'I gave you a direct order.'" It was then I realized why we had been left out that night. The short rounds could be explained as a mix-up if a little time expired. I might forget about it. What could I do now? Absolutely nothing. That regimental commander knew the result of his order. He had stood near the radio when we called for a ceasefire and explanation. What was this colonel thinking, after being warned by an experienced artilleryman? It brought up 2 questions. Why was my company selected to recover the body? It should have been the duty of Company H to do so. Did this man seek revenge on me, for my manhandling of him when he urinated on the army nurse? No doubt he had found that I was the man responsible for his degradation. This colonel later became a 2-star. Normally, weapons companies in a combat situation wouldn't be asked to do patrol work, although I often had while I was a platoon leader of Company H on Guadalcanal. However, except in one questionable case, my run-in with the Company G commander on Guadalcanal, these were all squad and section patrols in a stalemate situation, such as at Point Cruz. West Point Protective Association mentality put Combs above Hamer at Company H in a promotion. Situation. No doubt the man was well educated and indoctrinated, but he had absolutely no combat experience. He should have been worked into the system gradually, not pushed up the promotion ladder. It was his first patrol in enemy territory, and he'd wanted to do his best. He attempted to take that well-defended hill with a small patrol. We rifle companies had never been ordered to take Hill 250. If we had been so ordered, we would have accomplished it, but with a severe loss of men. I know how shocked we were at this unfortunate occurrence. What had happened was almost criminal, and it spoke for itself. A fine man with a brilliant future was lost. Late in February, Colonel G took the company officers on a trip along the 182nd Infantry Line to familiarize us in case we were required to reinforce any of their units. We were in battalion reserve at the time. On Hill 260, the artillery had a tree outpost of 80 to 100 feet above the jungle. Someone asked if anyone wanted to go up for a look. Curious, I volunteered, not bothered by heights. Hoisted to the top, I was disappointed, seeing nothing but the tops of trees. In fact, it was difficult to trace even the outline of the Torokina River. The only benefit I could see was that a more accurate azimuth could be taken on the Japanese 150 mm guns' flash when they fired at night. It might aid counter-battery fire. We continued south along their line until we reached the adjoining Company B of our 1st Battalion. I noted that the apron wire in front of their positions was complex, with a gate to allow passage of patrols. Behind Company B, which was located along a draw, was another ridge about 350 yards north of the 182nd Infantry's Hill, 260, paralleling it, but set off. The next day we were moved to this ridge as backup in case our front line was penetrated. We dug in securely with all battalion weapons, including a 37 mm anti-tank gun. From this high ground we had a perfect view of much of the Torquena River to our west, as well as hills 250, 600 and 1111 to the south. Fortunately, an earlier patrol had captured papers disclosing the date of an imminent attack. When it finally came at 7 a.m. on March 8th, we were prepared. At that hour, several enemy howitzers opened fire on us from hills 600 and 1111. Another fired from the far side of the Torquena River. As it was a bit overcast, each time a gun fired, its position was disclosed. We could see every flash. The 150 mm gun far to the west began firing steadily, hurling shells into the area of our artillery. The firing from hills 600 and 1111 looked like rapidly blinking lights. There must have been at least 8 cannon in action. For some reason, Colonel G was not present, but our regimental executive officer was. He walked confidently back and forth along the ridge since the fire was not falling on our backup line. The Japanese gun firing from the river was within range of our 37 mm gun. The crew yelled to me, "Can we return the fire? We can reach that gun just across the river." I said, "Hop to it." They fired 4 or 5 rounds before the executive officer ran down in a tizzy. He had turned pasty white. I could see he was scared stiff. "Who gave them permission to fire?" I wasn't dodging. "I did. Those Japanese are firing at us. We shot back. Stop it right now. I won't have it. I won't have it." I knew then and there he was a coward. His carefree walking ceased. He disappeared into a hole farther up the slope, and he didn't come out. The rest of us had a good laugh. Regretfully, I told the gun crew to cease fire. Their words were brief and loud. I hoped the exec heard them. As a result of the few rounds fired by the 37 mm gun crew, the Japanese howitzer by the river was silenced, probably saving lives in the rear area. The position of the 37 mm was such that it couldn't be seen from hills 600 and 1111 for counter-battery fire. The 37 mm gun crew was fully safe. Minutes later, I received a phone call from regimental headquarters, telling me to get back to my company bivouac area. It was being heavily shelled by the 150 mm gun. Upon my arrival, I found our mess tent and kitchen totally destroyed. Our supply tent was gone, the area littered with broken rifles and equipment. Our artificer, Joe Lauer, was digging frantically into the mess with a shovel. Just as I asked him what he was up to, a 150 mm incoming Japanese shell struck between our 2 rows of tents. It landed about 30 feet from us, tearing a big groove in the sand street. It failed to explode, ricocheting away with a whoosh-whooshing sound. Across the road, men were shouting. A truckload of 155 mm powder bags was blazing, set afire by the Japanese gun. I finally realized Joe was attempting to dig into their dugout. He yelled, "John is hurt bad. I can hear him. He says his rear end is torn up. Can you get a medic?" The entire area was apparently deserted. If anyone was available, he had to be in a hole. I ran to battalion headquarters, knowing the location of the large medical dugout. Shouting down the hole, I asked if a doctor was there. I heard loud arguing, then a voice said, "They're still shelling out there." Then another voice said, "He won't come out until the shelling stops." I blew up. "If he doesn't come out, I'm going to toss a grenade down there." Moments later, the doctor was bodily ejected from the dugout. Grasping his jacket, I put him on the run to our company area. The poor guy was white as a sheet and trembling like a leaf. He was terrified. By this time, Joe had Johnny Wells, our supply sergeant, out of the dugout. His one buttock was a bloody mess. While the doctor and Joe worked over Johnny, I checked my tent and found only a little damage, just a big hole in my sleeping bag made by a large piece of shrapnel. Returning to Sergeant Wells, I found him in good hands. The shelling suddenly ceased, allowing the few men in the area to come topside. When I returned to the ridge, the executive officer had disappeared. I hoped he felt thoroughly ashamed of himself, but doubted it. Much later, in the Philippines, I had a repeat performance of his cowardice. After the war, he was discharged from his position for lying about his college education. It seemed my unorthodox treatment of the surgeon was too much for him. His mind wouldn't adjust to the reality of combat. He was evacuated after this episode, but I did not hold him in contempt. Neither did I have scorn for a new officer of my company who shot himself in the leg the day after I arrived back on the ridge. Men do have a breaking point. It isn't everyone who can stand the constant stress of battle. I was fortunate, able to disregard immediate danger to do what had to be done. A sudden Japanese attack was launched on Hill 260 in the 182nd Infantry Sector at daybreak on March 10th. Wild, vicious fighting trapped the observer up on the tree platform. Company E of the 182nd took heavy losses. Flamethrowers, mortars, artillery, everything went but the proverbial kitchen sink. At the same approximate time, General Kanda, with a Japanese force, attacked the 37th Division, which held the left half of our perimeter line, in two different areas. The fire of the entire corps and division artillery was concentrated on Kanda's troops. On March 11th, while the fighting on Hill 260 continued, I was ordered to patrol upriver to Hill 250, then back to our battalion sector line. Upstream, we found the Japanese still occupied Hills 250 and 600. Retracing our steps downriver to the approximate juncture of the 164th and 182nd patrol sectors, we stopped to take a break. A patrol of about 20 men wearing helmets arrived, just out from the line. They were 182nd Infantry, and I spoke with the leader near the edge of the river. I don't remember the conversation, except that his patrol turned back toward home. Lieutenant Jim Pfeiffer of Easy Company had led his platoon well into the 182nd Infantry sector, as there were no definite maps or definitive points to identify. Calling to me, he pointed out a group of enemy crossing back and forth on the almost dry riverbed in the rear of Hill 260. Wounded Japanese were being carried piggyback to the west, while ammunition and other supplies were being carried east, up on Hill 260. We approached within easy rifle range, and Pfeiffer's men shot 7 enemy in the open riverbed, which at this point was about 450 feet wide. In an effort to obtain the identity of the enemy unit, Lieutenant Pfeiffer, Sergeant Disrud, and Corporal Catalfamo of Easy Company were wounded. Because of overhanging trees, I was unable to use our 60 mm mortars. Calling on the 300 radio for 245th Field Artillery fire, I was disappointed to learn they could shoot only in the 164th Infantry sector. After a long, agonizing wait, an officer answered from the other end, ordering me out of the sector. Here we had the opportunity to possibly stop the fighting on Hill 260, but were stymied by bureaucracy. The impression I got was that the 182nd Infantry would do all the fighting in the 182nd area and didn't need any help. I also got the impression that this was almost a private war. Upon our patrol's return to the lines, I was met by Colonel Dunn, who had now been assigned to the 182nd Infantry. When I explained the facts, he felt as disgusted as I. He asked me to present the circumstances to General McCulloch, a pompous man who was evidently running the Hill 260 show. The American Division commander had sent his executive to run the Hill 260 operation. This general had a private tent complete with tables and maps in the rear of the 182nd line. He dressed me down, saying in no uncertain terms that I had no business in the 182nd patrol area, and pooh-poohed all ideas I had about crossing the Torokina River and cutting off the Japanese supply line. He caustically informed me that I was only a civilian captain, while he was a graduate of West Point. His discourtesy, while I was doing my best to be polite, made me later realize my naivete. Attempting to explain a simple solution to a general is stupid. The next morning I was ordered to meet with several silver and birds and 2 carrying stars. I blew my cool. I was sick of red tape and incompetence and told them so. I added some pertinent remarks about graduates of the great school along the Hudson, of alcoholism and cover-ups. When I left that meeting, I knew I would be up for a court-martial but didn't give a damn. But it never happened. Perhaps my honest anger shamed them. Instead, a wonderful thing happened. A young lieutenant colonel, Jim Taylor, from the 245th Field Artillery, came up and put his hand on my shoulder. He said, "Charlie, not all West Pointers are pricks. The next time you want artillery fire, you call me. I'll see you get it." From that time on, whenever on a patrol, I asked for a forward observer from the 245th Field Artillery. I fondly remember a few: Lieutenant Kalansky, Captain Fall, and so many others whose names have slipped by these past years. Later, in the Philippines, the 245th did a great job for us. My bitterness stemmed from the feeling of being hamstrung by our own brass, who didn't really comprehend what was going on out in the field. They wanted us to do the job, but kept us from doing it by a set of meaningless rules. Really, what rules can there be in war? And to get 3 good men wounded for nothing, what a kick in the rear. Constant artillery attacks were made on Hill 250, but they were futile. The enemy simply moved to the other side of the peak for safety. A 90 mm anti-aircraft gun was moved to the nose of the ridge behind Company B, and timed fire was placed, with shell bursts just over the edge of the ridge. This may have disheartened the Japanese, but they didn't abandon the hill. A day later, I witnessed about 8 SBD dive bombers attacking hills 250 and 600. Suddenly, one aircraft broke away from the circling group and crashed into the jungle about 2 miles west of 250. Another aircraft flew by in front of us. The front toggles had apparently released, but a bomb hung at a 45-degree angle from the rear mounts. The pilot was shaking the plane violently, trying to dislodge the bomb. When the air show was finally over, we had lost 1 aircraft to enemy ground fire. On March 13th, it was our company's turn for the daily patrol. I sent Lieutenant Charles Ross with his platoon up the Torquena River on what was normally a routine task. The same day, Lieutenant Colonel Samuel G. took us company commanders on an inspection tour of the 37th Division line in case Japanese General Kanda's force made a breakthrough. As we followed along the various regimental lines of the 37th Division, we noted it was quiet, not a shot could be heard. The jungle to our front was decimated. An area of at least a half-mile square had been totally demolished by the massive artillery barrages. Grumbling could be heard from men along the line as we passed. "Those bastards are going to draw fire on us." Other vociferous comments followed as well. Crossing one bare stretch, Colonel G suddenly turned to me, saying, "Where is your gun, Captain?" Normally I carried a scope-equipped M1 rifle, but due to the walking involved, I had substituted a belt and a .45 caliber pistol hidden under my untucked jacket. Sliding my hand up my leg, I grasped the unseen pistol and thrust the muzzle against his stomach. "Here, sir." He froze for seconds, then said, "Point it away. It might go off." He wasn't afraid, but he was mighty surprised. Truthfully, I couldn't have made that draw again in 100 years. Upon our return, I found our company alive with excitement. Charles Ross's patrol had caught 13 enemies swimming in the Torquena River and had wiped them out. They had felt so secure in numbers that they had left no guard. All of their equipment on the riverbank had been recovered by his platoon. The best part, not a man was wounded or lost. Word came down that General Kanda, defeated, was heading west, attempting to gain the east-west trail by circling in the rear of hills 1111 and 600. Our battalion moved out, with Easy Company to take Hill 600 as soon as possible. I picked up a mortar observer and a platoon of machine guns from Company H, as well as a forward observer from the 245th Field Artillery. We reached the top of Hill 600 with little difficulty, and from there had an excellent view of Mount Bagana, the active volcano. This advantageous height enabled us to see both east and west forks of the Torokina River. Company G, under Captain Forrest Stimpson, went up the east fork of the Torokina to where General Kanda was expected to cross the river. Sure enough, at about 3:30 p.m., leading Japanese scouts began crossing the river, followed by larger groups pressing forward. Our artillery observer opened fire, churning the water to a froth. After a short delay, more men attempted to cross. Again, the artillery blasted them. Company H mortars entered the fray, but it was almost maximum range for them. Suddenly, I got a battalion call from Stimpson. "You won't believe what's coming across the river now. A Japanese is leading a white horse." Even without my field glasses, I could see the horse in the distance, midway in the river. It was General Kanda's personal horse. I had a hard time accepting the fact that a general in any army would be so arrogant and conceited as to bring his personal mount miles and miles through dense jungle, where every bit of feed had to be hand-carried by his men. This was outrageous, a total waste of manpower. It brought to mind the wastrels of our military schools with their so-called privileges and special flunkies to wait on them. As darkness fell, an American came up our hill with a Japanese prisoner. The American told me he had spent several years in Japan and spoke the language fluently. His prisoner was supposed to show us the location of the artillery pieces on Hill 1111 and possibly talk the Japanese soldiers there into surrendering. All that night, intermittent shelling of the river crossing and nearby jungle continued. Some of the shells seemed to pass so close to the top of our hill that we could almost reach out to touch them. I asked our artillery observer about short rounds. He shrugged and shook his head. "The shells you hear are clearing us adequately." When daylight came, the remaining Japanese had evidently cleared both forks of the Torokina and were well on their way toward the east-west trail. There was one other way to cut them off. That was to take a shortcut up Pendleton Creek to our west. They had to cross the creek somewhere. The next afternoon, Easy Company was ordered to relieve Company G and push up the creek. At this time, our battalion commander was Major Bill Moline. Somehow we had lost Lieutenant Colonel G in the shuffle. As we began our push up Pendleton Creek, we lost our 245 forward observer to another unit. We had our 60 mm mortars, but in heavy jungle they were worthless. The shells would become armed as soon as they left the mortar tube and explode overhead when going through any foliage. This lack of an artillery observer cost us the life of a man that day. It drizzled steadily. Everyone was wet and miserable. Those who wore glasses could barely see, as the small-billed fatigue caps were not waterproof, and the lenses were either constantly wet or fogged up. Steel helmets would have shed the rain, but they were not only heavy but impractical in heavy jungle. You couldn't hear well while wearing them, and your life often depended on your hearing. By 2 p.m. we found the SBD airplane that had crashed just days ago. It had burned, although the tail surfaces and cockpit were intact. The horizontal stabilizer was riddled with .50 caliber bullet holes. The pilot was missing, having probably bailed out at such a low altitude that his chute failed to open. His passenger had burned in the rear seat with the aircraft. His body had shielded his partially burned billfold, which was in his rear pocket. It contained his name and address, a $2 American bill and a $2 Canadian bill. His home address was Bismarck, North Dakota. When this information was passed to the men, one of them stepped forward. "He lives just across the street from me. I didn't know he was on Bougainville." After bagging up the remains of the man, I radioed back information about him and the serial numbers of the aircraft. Pushing on in the rain, our lead scout received Japanese fire at 4 p.m. The trail there was very narrow with a gentle bend. Upon being shot at and missed, our man retreated some 30 feet. I spoke to him, asking if he could again get near the position where he was fired upon. I wanted to set up a base of fire and flank the trail block. I told him specifically to stay off the trail and not take chances. He said, "Okay, but take my pack so I won't be encumbered." I took his pack. If I'd had artillery support, I would have backed off 150 to 200 yards and called for concentrated fire. Here, as in many other places, our mortars were useless. This was heavy jungle, difficult to penetrate. Turning, the scout went around the corner of the trail, standing upright, while I implored, "Get down! Get down! Get off the trail and crawl!" There was a single shot, dropping him in the centre of the trail. Sergeant Jacobson ran forward to recover him, just as a heavy machine gun opened up, the bullets throwing mud in our faces. Jacobson ran back, hopping on one foot. A machine gun bullet had penetrated his shoe and cut around the inside of his heel. The bullet stuck there was hot. The machine gun fired more bursts, which struck in the mud all around us. My radio operator, Private Amore, fearing for the safety of his new 300 radio, shouted to me, "What will I do with my radio?" I lost my temper. "Get your damn head behind it. Maybe it will save your life." We were in a poor place for manoeuvring. The creek was on our right, and the jungle to our left was nearly impenetrable. As darkness descended, the rain continued. There was only one alternative. We moved 350 yards back to the crashed airplane site to bivouac for the night. I awoke about midnight, frustrated and shivering, worried about the next day. I determined to cross the creek and bypass the trail block if possible. Wet and cold, I moved, clothes and all, into Pendleton Creek, the water of which was almost 95 degrees. It came from a hot spring of volcanic origin west of the active volcano Mount Bagana. Finally warm at last, I stepped out to roll up in a soaking wet blanket and managed a little more sleep. At dawn, I crossed 2 platoons to the opposite side of the creek and advanced upstream, hitting Japanese about a mile farther on, just as they were setting up an ambush. Lieutenant Charles Ross's men killed the machine gunner. We approached the machine gun position cautiously, knowing there were other enemies nearby. Upon our advance, we found a noose of vines that told us someone had tried to snag and pull the gunner from the trail. Finally, in contact with 3rd Platoon under Lieutenant Pete Sherrar across the creek, we found they had recovered our dead man and that the Japanese contingent had hastily abandoned their trail block. This must have happened when they heard our firing upstream, on the opposite side of the river. Their block had been well dug in, with a circular defence of about 10 to 20 men. Our artillery would have been the answer. It was overcast, still drizzling steadily when darkness came. Moving inland a couple of 100 feet, I set up a perimeter defence for the night. On the edge of this line, I began cutting the tall, wet grass to eliminate the usual chiggers. Someone walking by stopped to ask, "What are those 2 men doing over there?" He pointed to a low spot below me, perhaps 25 feet away, covered with tall grass. I glanced over and saw nothing. "Oh, Roche has probably put out an outpost." The man nodded and continued on. Moments later, another man stopped. "Who are those 2 men over there in the grass?" This time I stood up, but still could not see the 2 men. They must have ducked down. I said, "Get Sergeant Kerbaugh, be quick." In seconds, Kerbaugh was there, and aiming a bit to my right, opened fire with his Thompson. Grabbing my rifle, I ran parallel to the grass to cut off the 2 men I now knew were Japanese. Charles Ross followed me. Crouching, I could see a man's hands through the leaves, about 50 feet from me. He looked to be holding the breech of his rifle. Hesitating for a sure shot, I heard his rifle bolt click, only it wasn't his rifle bolt. He had popped a grenade and tossed it in the vicinity of Kerbaugh. When it exploded, Ross and I could hear men shouting. Just as Ross stood upright to check his men, another grenade exploded in the same location. Ross got a fragment in his leg. That smart Japanese had popped a second grenade under cover of the first explosion. It was a new lesson for me. We failed to find the bodies of either Japanese, but did recover a rifle dropped by one. Evidently he was wounded. It was a short carbine type I had never seen before, with a 9-inch triangular bayonet that folded under the barrel. Recovering my pack, I found one of the grenades had landed alongside it. The blade of my prized knife had been blown from the handle. My pack, blanket and poncho were shredded. All said, it was a disappointing patrol, ending after 7 days of rain. 10 men were slightly wounded by grenades and rifle fire, and one man was lost. For a month I was teased unmercifully about bedding down next to the Japanese. Upon examination of the damage done to our supply tent during the shelling by the Japanese 150 mm gun, it was discovered that our 10 new sniper rifles were totally destroyed. However, our supply sergeant, John Wells, had stored the 10 scopes in a .50 caliber ammunition box. They were safe, but there was a problem. They were Weaver 330 3-power scopes. How some high ordnance officer had authorized the purchase of these told of his ignorance. In addition, the so-called sniper rifles that had been destroyed were 1,900 3A1S. Some had only 2 lands and grooves cut in them. To any good rifleman, they were junk. The mounts on the damaged rifles were fine, so we removed them, travelling to the Seabees to have them welded onto M1 rifles. They were secured on the left side and zeroed for 300 yards. A bullet drifts to the right in a barrel with a right-hand twist, lands and grooves. This was partly compensated by the left side mount of the scope. Lieutenant Sherrar found that we could order training equipment through a branch of the Special Services, so we ordered a public address system with 2 speakers. It operated on either 6 or 110-volt current and had a phonograph. We received it in about 3 weeks, resulting in the men writing home for phonograph records. They vied for its use every evening. Glenn Miller was the favourite. I was surprised one afternoon when an officer of the Navy presented himself at my tent. It was Bill Guy, an SAE fraternity brother. We both had lived at the frat house in Fargo, pre-war, while attending the state college. He looked at me with a mischievous grin. "How did you get to be a captain when I'm only a lieutenant junior grade?" I gave him my stock answer. "Heck, Bill, they had to promote me. Everyone else was killed. Say, what is a Navy officer doing running loose?" "I'm off the destroyer Porter. She left me ashore and took off with the fleet during an air raid. They'll be back to pick me up." He expressed an interest in our patrol work, wanting to know more about the jungle, so I took him in a jeep across the Torokina River. Climbing up the far side, there was a snow-white Japanese skull on a post, equipped with a helmet tipped at a jaunty angle. Bill was a bit shocked, saying, "My God, what's that?" I laughed. "Why, that's a good Japanese soldier." Since the regimental headquarters company was originally from Fargo, North Dakota, Bill had many friends there. He expressed an interest in visiting them, so I dropped him off. After the war, he became the governor of North Dakota, serving 12 years, quite adequately, I must say. Shortly after the battle for Hill 260, our battalion commander called the company commanders and his staff together. We were going on some sort of orientation trip. To our surprise, we crossed the Torokina River on foot, moving west a quarter mile or so. Stopping there, we were to hear his words of wisdom. This was a man who had absolutely no personal experience with Japanese soldiers. To make matters worse, just 2 days prior to this outing, a company from our battalion had crossed the river, running into a major firefight. They had an officer killed. We were all antsy, knowing this was an unhealthy place to be. It made no sense. Was this man trying to show his bravado? To me, it was a grand show of stupidity. You just didn't cross the Torokina with only your battalion staff. There were lots of enemies still active in the area. On another occasion, the same gentleman decided we needed night training. My company was ordered to go out from the front lines along the jungle trail to Hill 250, then proceed downstream to the junction of the 164th Infantry and 182nd Infantry intersection. Finally, we were to proceed back into the perimeter. This was on a totally moonless night, dark as pitch. Leading off, holding to one another's jackets, we made it to the bottom of Hill 250. Stopping there, we took a break of perhaps 15 minutes. Proceeding downriver, we kept to the trail on the bluff rather than walking along the riverbed. Finally, we arrived back at the perimeter at about 4 a.m. That morning, I was told one of my men had found a Japanese pistol while on the night maneuver. I was curious. Just how did one find an enemy pistol in the dark? Upon speaking with the man, he said, "When we took the break at the bottom of Hill 250, I sat down on a lump. It was then I discovered I was sitting on a pistol. I asked, "What condition was it in? Was it rusty?" "Spotless. Here, I'll show you." It was indeed. I knew then that we had been close to trouble. We had no doubt interrupted a small party of Japanese that were disconcerted by our large numbers. How the pistol was dropped is conjecture, but you didn't find clean, spotless Nambu pistols everywhere. Another first hit our company. Sergeant Carmichael was bitten by a poisonous centipede. It had climbed into the blankets on his cot. His ankle swelled immensely, and the pain was terrific. After his recovery, the skin of his foot peeled like a bad case of sunburn. In July 1944, several of the men expressed an interest in firing the so-called Japanese knee mortar. As we had acquired these weapons and much ammunition on various occasions, we decided to try it out in the open area of the Torokina River, just below the Forks. This Japanese Model 89 grenade launcher, 50 mm, was never designed to be used on the knee. The recoil would instantly break your leg. It was a simple weapon, a tube with rifling, the range depending upon the angle it was held and the amount of barrel used. The firing pin actuated up and down in the tube, with ranges indicated on the outside. The farther down the barrel, the firing pin was lowered on the acme threads, the longer the range, and vice versa. The 50 mm grenade itself was approximately 6 inches in length, rounded on top with a flat base. The discharge primer was in the center of the base with surrounding discharge holes to propel the grenade into the air. At the time of discharge, a copper band near the base of the shell expanded to firmly grip the lands and grooves in the mortar, giving it longitudinal spin for stability. Small holes under the copper ring allowed the propelling gas to expand the ring when the missile was fired. The nose detonator of the round was protected by a safety pull-type split pin. The detonator was easily removed by unscrewing it in the opposite direction of the rifling in the tube. We fired the first of several rounds without nose detonators and found the small, so-called mortar to be a handy-dandy weapon. It was quick, easily portable, and effective. It weighed only 10 pounds, a simple, foolproof, deadly weapon. I often wondered why the Japanese didn't use it more effectively. Perhaps they had insufficient grenades. We all agreed that we needed such a weapon, but it wasn't until months later that our 60 mm mortars were equipped with a trigger base. That new base was an improvement. Still, you had to be fully exposed to fire the weapon. The Model 89 could be fired from any position, foxhole, direct fire, or even from a tree. Walking the trail along the fork of the Torokina, I chanced upon a 50 mm dud projectile. Deeming it harmless, I casually picked it up and tossed it into the nearby water. An explosion came that nearly bowled me over. It taught me a valuable lesson. Don't touch a dud shell. Evidently, the detonator struck a rock in the bottom of the stream. Sometime later, the men found a dud 105 mm shell, ours, in our bivouac area. When I called bomb disposal, an officer, a Native American, arrived. He looked at the shell, then whistled. "Stay away, I'll have to put a charge on it. 105 duds are deadly. It's a good thing no one tried to pick it up." Looking in the rear of his truck, I was shocked. There, on an old wool blanket, lay several artillery 150 mm projectiles and Japanese bombs. They were rolling loosely in the pickup box. This guy lived mighty dangerously. It reminded me of a Japanese bombing raid near the Lunga River on Guadalcanal. A large bomb had fallen next to the tent of several officers, driving deep into the ground. Fortunately, the bomb had failed to explode. A bomb disposal crew had dug very deep in the ground to recover it. The crew chief had cheerily told the tent mates, "You guys are lucky. This is the first dud of this type we've ever recovered. The fortunes of war, win some, lose some." While on Bougainville, we were subjected to an earthquake every couple of months. The ground would move in a slow, undulating motion, causing pots and pans in the kitchen to fall to the ground. This usually lasted from 5 to as many as 20 seconds. On one patrol up the Crown Prince Range, the rocks began to tremble. Although we could see no movement, the mountain groaned and grated as massive shifts were made. The sounds were much like those from that old radio show Inner Sanctum, quite eerie. It soon became apparent that each company would be subjected to a 10-day patrol each month. Our 164th Regiment, and no doubt the 182nd, began exploring the east-west trail, pushing the remaining Japanese west bit by bit. Often during the slack periods between these long-range patrols along the Crown Prince Range, we made short forays. It was on one of these jaunts that we patrolled up the west fork of the Torokina River to the base of the active volcano, Mount Bagana. I managed a J-3 airplane ride. This was purely a pleasure flight. The pilot took me over the edge of Mount Bagana at 8,000 feet to show me the litter of boulders in the central cone, which was about 300 yards across. From ground level at the perimeter line, the volcano looked pointed, with no indication of a crater. At one time during a recent earthquake, Bagana had mildly blown its top. Several of us had watched black specks high amid the clouds of steam. My pilot informed me that those black specks I saw were rocks the size of automobiles tossed in the air by the steam pressure. I believed him. Our patrol to Bagana was uneventful. We saw no signs of movement in the area. Coming down the west side of the slanting plateau, we came across an area littered with monstrous boulders, perhaps 8 to 12 feet in diameter. They had evidently been spewed from the volcano during previous massive eruptions. It was then someone shouted, "Hey, there goes a native!" We had always endeavoured to bring locals into the Angao, Australia, New Guinea Auxiliary Unit, compound run by the Australians. They pacified and fed these people, talking them out of their most deadly weapon, that bow with long arrows. But what arrows? They were about 3.5 feet in length, with many thorns extending back about 10 inches from the poisoned tip. The poison looked much like the luminous paint on old alarm clocks. Once the arrow was inside a person, it was impossible to extract. I had 2 sets of bows and arrows lent to me by a friend, Warrant Officer Bruce Watterson of the Australian Army. He was one of the Angao bosses. He wanted $25 for each set, and foolishly I failed to buy one. I didn't think it would arrive at home, fearing that some SOB would steal it, as so often happened to anything sent back to the States. We hunted high and low for that native, knowing he was within a 40-acre spread. He was never found. He probably hid under a massive boulder and covered himself with smaller rocks. Just as we reached the forks of the Torokina River on our return trip, we did meet 2 native male adults with a small boy, perhaps 10 years of age. They made no effort to escape us and appeared friendly. The boy carried their fire, a small woven basket that held a burning material. While I endeavoured to speak with the 2 men, one stripped a piece of bark from a rotting tree. There, exposed to sight, were several large, white, fuzzy grubs. Stuffing a handful into his mouth, the grubs squirmed in his lips. They must have tasted good, as he licked the remains away with a smile. I watched, fascinated. I found they were working for Angao, trying to get other natives to come into the compound. Proceeding downriver to the 182nd sector, we found no sign of the enemy in the area. It appeared that the Torokina River was finally free of Japanese. Earlier, in May, we had received another new officer, Lieutenant Milton Shedd. This put us in officer overstrength, but Lieutenant Sherrar was unavailable to us, being on special duty, managing the division boxing team and special services. Milt mixed well with the officers and was well liked by his platoon. When we officers matched off in the evenings, putting on boxing gloves, I rued the solid punches Milt handed out. The following is from Lieutenant Milton Shedd's letters sent to his wife after he was assigned to Easy Company in 1944. "It never ceases to amaze me how much is done to make things comfortable out here for the fighting men. If the Japanese knew how high our standard of living is, I'm sure they'd throw up their hands in disbelief and then in amazement. What's the use of all this? Tojo must not be such a hot shot if he can't give us half the things the Americans have. The weather here isn't nearly as hot and bad as I thought it would be. The ground is sandy and dry, although it rains almost every night. Conventional storms. At night it is cool enough to use one wool blanket. Must go look at a training site where we practice making an assault and mop-up, following tanks. We will be firing live ammunition. After that we are going fishing. It's raining harder than I've ever seen it rain before. Our tent in this rear area is flooded. The water is running in streams in every direction. It's getting nice and cool, though. We are going to the front for the night. P.S. May 24th. The problem ran smoothly. It is 8 a.m. and we are waiting for class to start. Each student sits on a box containing two 4.2-inch high explosive shells, weighing about 30 pounds apiece. Our lecture is on vesicant gases, mustard, lewisite, and nitrogen mustard. The area around our camp has been cleared of all vegetation except for the great massive trees, which are quite numerous. These trees, mahogany, etc., for the most part have a tangled mass of roots and vines. Each tree has its own little clan of lizards, which grow fat eating the local bugs. Just finished a good dinner. We had fresh roast pork, the first meat that wasn't canned since I've arrived on the island. We usually have pancakes or mush, or both for breakfast, red dog, mixture of ground-up dried beef and hot dogs, for lunch, and either red dog or fish for dinner. Today we had fresh celery. Every few days we get fresh greens, onions, etc. Of course, dehydrated potatoes, corn, peas and carrots are always present, as is canned fruit. It gets tiresome eating the same old thing day after day. I've been out in the jungle for 4 days. I saw lots of Japanese, all dead and pretty well rotted away. I wasn't scared, but tingly, the same sensation I have when I am tracking a buck or waiting for a big goose to fly overhead. I've been conditioning myself to become a better swimmer. Last Saturday we went swimming. The sea was rough and waves high. I could see cross currents sweeping through the surf, but people were swimming. The riptides were very strong, and in 2 instances, as we drove along the beach, there appeared to be dark brown rivers flowing out to sea. I could not touch bottom, and worse still, found myself in a current taking me out to sea. I wasn't a bit scared as I had complete confidence in my ability to get back to shore. Suddenly I heard someone hollering for help. Another boy near me struck out for the man. He was about 25 yards away. He had a lot of guts trying to save the drowning boy, as he was not a good swimmer. The drowning man climbed on top of him, and down to the bottom they both went. I didn't want 2 drowning men on my hands, so I told the other fellow to go in and send out a boat if he thought he could make it. We were about 200 yards out, and the current wasn't slackening at all. I found out his name when I tried to calm him down. He was in a bad way, completely exhausted and scared. I told him to listen to reason, asking him his name and where he was from. He said Bob, from Idaho. I told him to put his right arm around my waist and relax. I kept him afloat with his head above water until he said he was better. By this time we were now about 500 yards out, and I became a little uneasy. I could see 5,100 men on shore watching, but not doing a thing. By this time the current subsided, and although I was getting tired, I started dragging him slowly back toward shore. The rising swells helped a lot. We rode a few more swells together, and when I saw a big wave coming, I told him we'd try to ride it in separately. I made it in about 30 yards farther than he, thinking the wave would finish me. It swirled, tumbled, and dashed me madly. When it passed, I could touch bottom, but I never expected to see Bob again. There the plucky devil was, again shouting, "Help! Help! Help!" I got to him, and it was easy from then on. When he caught his breath, he asked me who I was. I said, "Lieutenant Shed." He said, "Gosh, a lieutenant! Thanks a lot for saving my life." After my patrol up the Numa Trail, I was asked for information concerning what my battalion commander did that night, to help him get a medal. Actually, he did no more than most privates in our company, and less than any man on my patrol. I told him I had no information, very politely, referring him to other officers that were involved. The number of medals doled out to the brass is out of proportion to those given to enlisted men. The officer that called me was quite disgruntled with what he got from me. I will miss the gang at Easy, as they are a fine bunch of men. I'll miss them all, especially Lieutenant Ross. A small problem occurred between Company F and Easy. 1 or 2 Company F men were stealing from Easy tents. Thankfully, I was informed and actually witnessed a Company F man running from one of our tents. At the time, the tents were very close, almost back to back. I spoke with the captain of Company F. He couldn't see trouble coming if he had 4 eyes. Being raised in farm country, I knew a fence was the solution. It would be much like apron wire, stopping all running back and forth, except at the open ends of the company streets. I had a 5-strand barbed wire fence built between Easy and Company F tents, and this stopped all further trouble. In June, I received orders to report to regimental headquarters. Colonel G wanted to see me. He had taken over command of the regiment from Crump Garvin in April. Evidently, word of my fence had preceded me, with some officers thinking me ridiculous. Colonel G came right to the point. "Why did you build that fence between Company E and Company F?" I said, "Colonel, I've lived and worked on farms. We fence in bulls from the beef cows until breeding season. We fence in our horses and other farm animals, all to eliminate trouble. I spoke with the Company F captain about future trouble. He just didn't give a damn, so I took the matter in hand. There won't be any more stealing." He looked at me thoughtfully, then asked, "How would you like to take over the anti-tank company? There seems to be little leadership there." "No, sir. I was in that outfit once and was mighty glad to get out. I tangled with the captain, who was later reduced in grade to a first lieutenant. I got sick of drunken, misfit officers. Don't get me wrong, I like a drink, but I don't drink on duty. I want nothing to do with the anti-tank company. Easy is a top rifle company. They are great soldiers and have dedicated officers." He gazed at me for a few moments, then said, "Okay, that's that. You may as well return to your unit." Word that a large portion of the Japanese fleet had moved to Rabaul harbour from their bastion at Truk brought a quick response from the fighters and bombers on Bougainville. We soon got word and watched anxiously as scores of B-24S, B-25S, F-6Fs, Corsairs, P-38S, and other aircraft made trip after trip north. They must have gotten a hot reception, for the B-24S usually left in groups of 8 to 10. Many returning groups were down to 4 or 5. We watched one returning B-24 point out to sea, several men bailing out at the last moment. Stopping by the airport that afternoon, my driver and I watched a B-25 make a wheels-up emergency landing, tearing up a long strip of metal matting. The aircraft made a perfect soft landing on its belly, then began a turning twist as it slowed on the runway. It finally stopped about 100 yards from us, the crew exiting frantically to run from a possible explosion or fire. After running 100 yards or so, the widely scattered crew stopped to look back. Since no fire or explosion took place, they sheepishly walked back to the aircraft to collect their gear. We didn't know if the plane had dumped its bomb load, but we could see heavy flak damage about the fuselage. That evening, just before dark, John Gossett stopped by, saying, "Let's go over to the strip and watch them come in at dusk." We stopped our jeep near the west, incoming end of the active runway, as several F-6Fs landed, one by one. Apparently, the last one to touch down had an engine failure just short of the runway. It just quit flying, dropping like a stone, crashing about 200 yards short of the strip. It immediately burst into flames. We felt helpless, not being able to assist in any way. Ammunition in the fiery wreck began to explode as we watched. A feeling of deep depression hit me at that moment. It took some time for me to realize. That pilot was doing his job just like the rest of us. We all take our chances in war. As Easy was scheduled to move up the Laruma River for our next patrol, I managed to get an orientation flight with a pilot named Rosen. He wore shorts, carried no gun, and had no emergency rations in his small plane. I thought it almost foolhardy at the time and told him so. He just shrugged his shoulders and smiled. The Cub J3 strip was narrow and short, hewn from the jungle near the ocean by sea bees. We flew up the Laruma River 15 miles, circling over our future position on the northwest side of the river. On the return flight, I spotted a narrow trail leading up a high mountain and indicated to Rosen that I would like to look it over. Our eyes led us up to the top of the mountain, where there was a village. The several nipper huts were apparently deserted. The trail upward could easily have been defended at several points. After all, these people were headhunters and raided each other's villages. Somehow, it reminded me of my grade school books about the Greek defence at Thermopylae, or was it Troy? The flight lasted about an hour, convincing me that fighting in the Laruma Valley would be no picnic. General Kanda had come out of this valley in his attempt to surprise the 37th Division. There was no flat territory here. Everything seemed straight up and down. Fiji's 3rd Battalion had moved to Bougainville shortly after the New Year. I renewed my acquaintance with George and Edward Kakabau. We soon began visiting back and forth. Whenever beer or booze was available, we shared and celebrated. I even became acclimated to their tea with lemon. On one of my visits to the Fiji Battalion, I took Lieutenant Charles Ross along. He and Captain George Kakabau hit it off, immediately cooking up a plan for Charles to accompany George on the next Fijian patrol. At the time, Easy Company was recuperating after a 10-day patrol to the west. On June 23rd, while in heavy jungle, the Fijians ran into machine gun fire from a strongly held Japanese position. Several men were wounded, and the remainder pinned down. A Fijian corporal named Sukanaivalu crawled forward twice to rescue the wounded, then was himself hit hard. The firing became so intense that Charles found grenades thrown by the enemy landing behind him. Corporal Sukanaivalu, realizing he could not be rescued, called out to his squad to abandon him. Finally, to stop further rescue attempts, he purposely rose up to take more machine gun fire. He was posthumously awarded the first Victoria Cross, given to a British colonial soldier in the war. To say the least, Charles was greatly impressed with the Fiji 3rd Battalion. On another occasion, I was invited to George's company for an evening dinner. The aperitif was beer, lots of it, with a monstrous bowl of spicy conch chowder. George's mess sergeant was Indian, an accomplished cook. Most of his Company A men were fishermen with experience. They had made outrigger canoes immediately upon their arrival, never lacking for Neptune's bounty. The party went on for the better part of the night, and finally I could barely stay awake. I finally said, "I've got to take Easy up the Laruma Valley tomorrow. We're to relieve a company of the 145th Infantry." George laughed. "Yes, and you'll sweat out all that beer on the way too. It'll be hot as hell." He was right. Before noon, trucks moved us to the river through the 37th Division sector. From there, it was a long 15-mile walk upriver under a scorching sun. We bedded down for the night on the northeast side of the river near a crew of 4.2 chemical mortars, our fire support, as we were out of range of our artillery back in the perimeter. I visited them to find they had a 300 radio on our frequency. I was also informed the mortar rounds were the equal of 105 artillery shells. They had plenty of ammunition and assured me of immediate fire as needed. Battalion wanted a small group for a patrol to scout upriver toward Igarue on the Numa Numa Trail. I picked Lieutenant Shed for the job. He had joined Easy early in May, taking over the command of a platoon with confidence. I knew he was well liked by the men. I also knew he was exceptionally capable. It was quiet that night. Early in the morning, the remainder of the company crossed the river on a huge, slimy log, easily 6 feet in diameter. My executive officer, Harry Mork, proceeded to fall off the log into the river amid shouts of amusement from the men. The look of chagrin on his face as he stood in the fast-moving current, submerged to his chest, was the epitome of frustration. Attached to me at the time was a platoon of machine guns from Company H. Their commanding officer, Dick Hamer, had come along. The uphill climb to the unit we were relieving was nearly vertical, requiring the constant use of both hands. By 11 a.m., we arrived at the top of the ridge to find the unit of the 145th Infantry already descending past us. No doubt they were mighty glad to be replaced. One of their officers stopped to tell me they had lost a sergeant while trying to take the next hill. They had been unable to recover his body. Dick Hamer and I walked the crest to determine the best locations for the machine guns. Looking across at the hill to our northeast, I figured we could take it easily by concentrating our firepower, using smoke for cover. Hopefully, we would be able to recover the 145th Sergeant's body. 2 men from our battalion intelligence showed up with a 20-power spotting scope. I put them both in a forward hole to look for Japanese positions. Maxwell, one of the two men, came to me just before nightfall. "Hey, Captain, take a look through the scope." There, well down on the forward slope of the hill, was a camouflaged position, with a log across the front. A pair of Japanese eyes could be seen under the edge of the log. He was looking directly at us, the range about 200 yards. Maxwell turned to me. "Can I borrow your scope rifle? I've never shot at a Japanese."